Formula One is the most popular racing series in the world right now. F1 was created in 1946, with FIA being the creator. During the 1950s to the 1970s, there were tremendous technological changes to the car which allowed the FIA to improve the performance of the cars overall. These changes created an existing race which allowed F1 to become a popular sport. As you can see, I'll be driving the Maserati 250F 6-cylinder on the Silverstone 1967 track. So, let's begin.
Before the 1950s, F1 cars were bulky, heavy, and lacked the aerodynamics and grip of a race car. The 1950s was an era where the drivers, teams, and engineers worked to make significant changes to the cars. One of these changes was the development of a power unit. At the start of the 1950s, F1 cars had a 2.5-litre straight-six engine holding 88 horsepower per litre, also known as 65 kilowatts per litre. If you were to do the calculations, it will bring it to a total of 220 horsepower, aka 164 kilowatts, but unfortunately, due to the lack of power and the weight of the car, it would reach around 300 kilometers an hour throughout the decade. Formula One kept the 2.5-litre straight-six until the early 1960s. There were other drawbacks of the car, such as the lack of grip. They heavily relied on road tyres in order to sustain grip on the track. But unfortunately, you couldn't go from stop to 200 kilometers an hour in a straight line without having to correct the car. Even through corners, the car would suffer a lack of grip on the tyre because there wasn't anything to sustain grip for a period of time. The mid-third and fourth gears were the only gears the car had to maintain grip through corners. Otherwise, the driver would be correcting the car most of the time in order to stay on track. The reason the car lacked grip was because of the tyre width. The tyre width was so small. This problem wasn't resolved until the 1960s, but I'll get there in a sec. The gearbox was also one of the main factors of the car, as it had a manual transmission, meaning that the cars relied on a clutch pedal and a gear stick in order to change gears and increase top speed. The RPMs being produced were roughly between 6,000 to 9,000 depending on the car, as every car was different. The Maserati 250F, as you can see what I'm driving right now, only produces 7,600 RPM, which if you don't know, RPM stands for revolutions per minute. The cars back then weren't so as advanced as what we have in today's Formula One car, which has a sequential gearbox with paddle shifters, meaning that the cars today would only rely on the pedal behind the steering wheel in order to change gears. F1 cars didn't move to a sequential gearbox until 1989. The chassis is the body of the car, where everything is held in place by the steering wheel, gear shifter, gearbox, engine, tyres, suspension, etc. The chassis also adds weight to the car so that the car can gain grip so that it would not slide all the time while it's going at high speeds. The chassis was made out of aluminium with steel tubular frames until 1962, when a man named Colin Chapman created the monocoque, which if you guys don't know, the monocoque is a French word for single shell, and basically the monocoque is the shell of the chassis, protecting the chassis from any collisions or crashes to prevent damage to the major parts of the car that keeps it running, and so it prevents the car from any critical damage but at a cost of extra weight to the car. In order for the car to move, they need an accelerator and brakes to stop the car. How the brakes work is that when the brakes have been pressed down, you will start to feel a bit of pressure called brake pressure. The cause of brake pressure is that the car has master cylinders, which have a hose connected to the master cylinders to the brake calipers, and the fluid, called brake fluid, adds pressure to the brake calipers that forces the brake pads to press against the brake discs and forces the tyre to stop by the cost of high brake disc temperature and tyre wear. The double wishbone was created in the 1930s by a French car called Citroën and was introduced into Formula 1 in 1962, which created great flexibility when it comes to curves, allowing better comfortability for the driver rather than bouncing around all the time, and allowed better cornering ability since the double wishbone chassis was wider, which improved grip and aerodynamics to the car. In 1968, the first integrated wings were developed to improve aerodynamics so that it could increase better cornering ability and better stability so that the car wouldn't lose too much grip when going high speeds and cornering, but would reduce the top speed of the car and fulfill the car's absolute potential. The car engineers needed to adjust the cars so that it balanced out the top speed and the aerodynamics. The driver made the call to tell the engineers what to adjust in the car. The ingenious fan car was made in 1978 and it had a huge fan at the back of the car to bring a large amount of air under the chassis, which increased aerodynamics and cornering ability. One drawback though was it's slightly unreliable as the fan was too big and drawing too much power, and with this it would break the car and possibly catch it on fire. With that, the FIA officials had to ban the fan due to its unreliability. A major innovation was the design of the ground effect. The ground effect is when the car literally sucks itself to the ground, increasing top speed. As the air gets under the car lowers itself closer to the asphalt on the track. It also increases grip and downforce, increasing its cornering ability, but once you start to brake, the car lifts itself to original height once again. Now, you must be wondering, how does the car suck itself to the ground? Well, in order for the car to suck itself to the ground, you need to know why this is happening. This is due to the Venturi effect. How this works is that the bottom of the car has a curve on both ends and the air goes under that curve, which squeezes the air to a point where it quickly escapes that to a small gap and enters through the other end. Unfortunately, F1 banned the ground effect in the early 80s but decided to bring it back in 2021. Without the ground effect, the car behind will lose half of its aerodynamics due to the disruption of air being tabulated by the car in front. Therefore, it would have enough aerodynamics to get through corners like the car in front would, giving whoever is in front has a better advantage, until DRS came into play, but the car behind still has a way to catch up, increasing about 20 kilometers to the car in front, giving out equal advantages to the car in front and behind. Nowadays, F1 cars have been included with a turbocharged engine and have been brought back in 2014 to increase power to increase top speed. 1977 was the first introduction to turbocharged engines in Formula 1. With the increase of horsepower to the engine, it would increase acceleration to get up to speed much quicker as the turbo is connected to the engine and air intake. You would get a weird sound, and that's because of the stifling air being released from the air intake and allowing cooler air to get in the air intake, pushing the air towards the engine and releasing the same amount of stifling air out of the engine to keep the engine cool so that it can last longer and doesn't overheat. The ingenious fan car was made in 1978 and it had a huge fan at the back of the car to bring a large amount of air under the chassis, which increased aerodynamics and cornering ability. One drawback though was it's slightly unreliable as the fan was too big and drawing too much power, and with this it will break the car and possibly catch it on fire. With that, the FIA officials had to ban the fan due to its unreliability.